Hello, Sunrise students. It's Miss Isaac. I'm back to read you Chapter 6 of Song for a Whale. So settle in and get comfortable. The secretary was picking up the phone when she saw me coming, and I waved to her on my way into Principal Shelton's office. Miss Shelton wasn't there, so I went ahead and rearranged the furniture. I slid the black chair over to one side of the desk. Mr. Charles would sit there, so I could see both him and Miss Shelton at the same time. I sank into my favorite chair and stared at the ceiling while I waited. Miss Shelton came in and sat behind her desk, then held out her arms as if she were saying, "Well?" I shrugged. No point in chatting until Mr. Charles got there. I reached up to the pendant I wore around my neck, the one made from an old Zenith radio knob. They used to emboss the wooden knobs with a raised Z-shaped lightning bolt. In my room at home, I had a collection of antique radios. I did some repair work for Mr. Gunner's antique shop, and sometimes, lots of times, I ended up buying radios from him after I fixed them. I'd made the pendant so I'd have a piece of my collection with me even when I was away from home. While we waited, I traced the jagged edges of the letter with my fingertip. Mr. Charles came in a few minutes later. "Welcome," I signed as he took the seat across from me. I pointed to a picture on Miss Shelton's desk that I hadn't seen before. "New grandbaby?" "Yes, that's Henry," she said after Mr. Charles interpreted my question. "Now, tell me what happened in the cafeteria." Miss Shelton knew what happened. I was sure of that. She always wanted to get to my side of the story. One of those things they teach in principal school. Find out what happened and then question the kid to see if they lie about it. Mr. Charles interpreted between Miss Shelton and me as I filled her in. "Nina was only trying to ask what you were having for lunch," she said. I actually slapped myself in the forehead. All this because Nina wanted to know what kind of sandwich I had? "She was trying to make conversation with you, Iris, to be friendly." "No, she's not," I signed. "She's trying to show off and pretend she knows something she doesn't. She needs to keep her hands out of my face." Miss Shelton reminded me of the school's zero-tolerance policy for fighting. I tried to argue that I was only removing someone's hands from my personal space, but it was no use. At school, that counted as fighting. "This isn't fair." I slumped back in the chair and looked out the window at the parking lot. Mr. Charles waved to get my attention and interpreted the rest of what Miss Shelton said. "The other students at the lunch table did say that you tried to get Nina to stop when she got so close to you. We'll talk to her about respecting personal space. If it happens again, tell a teacher instead of shoving someone." Okay, I left it at that. Miss Shelton probably wouldn't like it if I pointed out that shoving was a lot quicker than flagging down a teacher and scribbling a note to explain what was going on. I'd have in-school suspension for the next 2 days, starting right then. That meant I'd sit in one room all day and my teachers would send my work there. Fine with me. Regular suspension would have been even better. At home, I could fly through my schoolwork and then start on some radio repairs. That was probably why they didn't do it, because they'd figured out it was too much like a vacation. Then Miss Shelton slipped in the worst part. "And you'll have to apologize to Nina when you return to class." Maybe she'd forget about that. By the end of school day, I had a text from Mom. "Get straight home after school." Of course, Miss Shelton had called to let her know of my sentencing. I biked toward home after school, but I wasn't in a big hurry to get there. My parents had told me I'd be in serious trouble if I got sent to the principal's office again, even though there was a whole month left of school. I wasn't sure what they meant by serious trouble, but some things were better left a mystery. That morning, I'd been working on a radio repair for Mr. Gunner, a mint-colored Zenith from the 1950s. That was why I was a little late getting to school. I was so close to fixing it, but then I realized I didn't have what I needed to finish the job. Mr. Gunner wasn't in a hurry. He always told me to take the time I needed to do the job right, but I couldn't stand to leave anything sitting around broken. It chased me until I couldn't ignore it anymore. The junkyard was on the way home, sort of. At the gate of Moe's Junk Emporium, I hopped off my bike even before it stopped rolling. My eyes scanned the dead appliances section as I ran up the sidewalk. Always so many dishwashers and washing machines, but there was a monster-sized TV radio record player set. Not that it had a big screen. I mean, it was thick. You'd have to set it at least 3 feet away from the wall. I ran over for a closer look. Made by Admiral in the 1950s, I was pretty sure. The set featured decades of dust that had sunk into the scratches of the wood cabinet and tatters of cloth hanging from the speaker. Hopefully the insides were in better shape. The TV and record player weren't much use, but the radio might have the exact parts I needed. I took out my phone to text Grandpa. It was the kind of thing he'd pick up for me before someone else grabbed it. I typed a few words before I caught myself. Sometimes I'd think of something to tell him before remembering he wasn't there to answer me. Then I felt bad for forgetting. Shouldn't I always feel it, missing him? After erasing the message, I changed it to, "Wish you were still here." Even though he wouldn't receive it, I clicked send before slipping the phone back into my pocket. He seemed closer then, just like sending that short message would somehow let him know I was thinking of him. "I haven't forgotten you. Sometimes I just don't remember you're not here." My brother Tristan could drive me back later to get the set, but it might be gone by then. If I asked Mom or Dad to pick it up, they'd wonder why I was at Moe's instead of at home. I'd ask Moe to hold it for me. He knew me well enough by now, so it'd just take a minute to tell him I was interested in the set. But when I ran into the trailer that served as the office, Moe wasn't behind the desk smoking a cigar like he always was. Some guy, a little older than Tristan, sat there, watching a TV show where people threw chairs at one another. The patch on his blue work shirt read, "Jimmy Joe." Jimmy Joe stood up and said something when he noticed me in the doorway. I never liked talking to people I didn't know. This was an emergency, so I would. But by talk, I mean write notes back and forth. I hated the way people looked at me when they didn't understand my deaf accent. Since I didn't know if I talked very well, I'd rather not do it. Plus, I never liked the way my voice felt. As much as I loved feeling sound from a radio speaker, vibrations in my throat annoyed me as if they didn't belong there. Kind of like how I loved electronics, but not on my own ears. At the desk, I scribbled on a notepad. "Can you save that Admiral set out there for me? I'll come back for it later." He looked back at me after reading the note, and his face was a question. I pointed to my ear and then shook my head to let him know that these ears were as busted as everything else around there. His eyes widened like they did with most people. A sound of panic, like they're not sure what to do with me, or like I might explode in front of them. "Can you, read lips or talk?" he asked, pointing back and forth from his mouth to mine. Maybe, I thought, but how about just reading that note in your hand? I tapped the paper he was holding. He recovered, then pointed out the window. "It don't work." His mouth was really wide when he formed the words. He was probably yelling. He shook his head and waved his hands to emphasize the point. I held back an eye roll. Of course it didn't work. Even if it worked, it wouldn't really work. Those old antenna TVs haven't been able to get a signal for years. After taking back the note, I wrote, "For parts." When he read that, his eyebrows rose from scared to impressed. "I'll ask my dad," Jimmy Joe wrote back. "Doctor appointment. He'll be back soon." So Moe was his dad. From what I'd witnessed during my time as a junkyard customer, Moe started each day with a can of Budweiser and a whole hog breakfast sandwich from the cattle prod, in addition to the cigar, so a doctor visit was probably a good idea. Too bad he didn't pick a more convenient day to start caring about his health. I added, "Tell him it's for Iris. Thanks." While Jimmy Joe read that, I tore another page from the pad, wrote my name on it, then ripped a piece of tape from the dispenser on the desk. Without waiting for a response, I ran outside and slapped the Iris Bailey note on the Admiral. It was almost 9. Even though I was in serious trouble, I smiled the whole way home. Hope you enjoyed today's chapter. I'll see you tomorrow.